Hello and welcome to episode 61 of the Large Format Photography Podcast. My name is Andrew Bartram and I'm joined by Eric Matthey and Alys Tomlinson. Hello, Eric.
Hello, Andrew, and Simon in the background. And hi, Alys.
And hello, Alys.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Hi, Alys. Well, it's great to have you back on the show after all the COVID madness. Thanks for
it's been a while.
Thanks for being with us. Before we just go any further, just to say thank you to Frank Thorpe for being our last guest, which was about a month ago.
Yeah,
so
yeah. A little bit
there we are.
Yeah,
Alys, Frank. I don't know if you know Frank Thorpe. He photographs with a large format camera at the Capitol building in America.
Oh, wow.
And he was there on that fateful day when it was stormed, you know?
Yeah, wow.
Mm-hmm.
And he did a project called 100 Days After the Riot or something like that. And we photographed 12 individuals in the locations they found themselves during the riot, you know? So leader of the House and Mitch Romney.
A cafeteria worker who locked himself into a closet.
Yeah.
Oh, I will. That sounds extremely interesting. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah. It was good. So, Alys, 2019. So, if folks want to just listen to all of Alys's bio, they can go back and listen to show 16. So, we'll just take a pause while you go and do that.
Yeah, go do that. Which is 16. Good Lord.
No, 16.
That's
it was a while ago.
That is a while ago.
So, welcome back, and thank you for coming back with us, and welcome back to our guests who've just gone off to listen to show 16. So when you came on last, Alys, it was the end, I think, pretty much of your 5-year Ex Voto project,
Mm-hmm.
which documents landscape and people and faith, and you traveled through Lourdes and Ireland and
Poland.
Where else did you go?
Eastern Poland, yeah.
Oh, and Poland, yes.
Uh-huh.
And I reread. Sorry, I reread reread the introduction to your book, which accidentally is now out of print, isn't it?
Well, yeah,
it's now out of print.
Sold out. It is out of print. Yeah,
I couldn't see a copy for less than £150 on online. So I think
a bit silly, but yeah, it is out of print for the moment. You can find the other copy online, I think.
You can find the on copy. So I reread the to remind myself a little bit about it, and I listened to bits of the previous podcast. But really, to sum up, Martin Luther and people like Calvin were rallying against pilgrimages and what they meant, and maybe the commercialization of relics and stuff. So you sort of went back and looked at modern day pilgrimages and what people left behind on their journeys, and you ended up photographing bits of relics in the landscape and indeed some of the people you met on the way. Is that a fair summation of Ex Voto?
Yes. I mean, I can talk for hours about Ex Voto because it was a big big part of my life for a long time. But yes, it was exploring the ex votos themselves, so the objects that people leave as kind of gestures of their devotion, and the portraits. So it was portraits of the pilgrims in these sacred sites and the wider landscape. So there was 3 kind of strands. But yes, I think you summarised it pretty well.
Good. I spent hours researching, as I always do. When you when we left that recording, you'd been given some prize money, I think, to go off and do something with Sony. So you were working on a video project with Vera, which does not sound like a Belarusian nun, but anyway. And I think you've been back 4 times. You've been back 4 times.
Okay, so this was in 2019. Is that correct? I can't
Probably.
remember.
Yeah.
Yes. So I was given some money by Sony, a grant, and the idea was that I could use the grant for whatever I wanted. And my plan at that point was to use the grant to finish Ex Voto, which at that point wasn't complete. And obviously Ex Voto was all shot on a large format camera and 5:4 and black and white film. So I thought, well, great, I've got some extra money. I'll use this grant money to finish the Ex Voto project. And then I remember them saying, well, that's fine, we'd like to give you the money, but just to let you know that with the grant money, the kind of proviso of you having this grant is that it all has to be shot using Sony equipment. So, of course, that was like a bit of an issue for me, because having spent 5 years shooting on large format camera to suddenly switch to digital, well, it just wouldn't have worked. It's a completely different way of working. But I didn't want to lose the opportunity of the grant. So I decided to explore the life of one of the nuns at that point called Vera, who had a very, very big influence on me when I met her and photographed her for Ex Voto. And she had become the kind of most significant portrait or photograph that I'd taken for that project, because she was an incredibly enigmatic and kind of beguiling character, and I knew she had many layers and stories to tell. So I went off to Belarus for the first time to stay with her in her monastery, and have now 4 years down the line, I'm co-directing it with a woman called Cecile, who actually assisted me on Ex Voto, and we're now at the stage where we're actually doing kind of test screenings, which is why I have to dash after this, because we have another test screening of the rough cut. So we're at the rough cut stage, and it's become a documentary feature film, which is something that I had never expected, because I thought it was going to be a week in Belarus making like a 6-minute film about her life. But her life is so interesting and surprising and kind of powerful, her story, that it really demanded more time. So it ended up being a feature film that has been supported. We're lucky we're supported by Sundance Institute. So the Sundance Documentary Fund has supported it. And we're now at the stage where it actually feels that it's going to become something that after 4 years of work and research and visits, and her story shifting, as of course, over that time, and also us getting to know her on a different level. So my relationship with Vera has gone from making some photographs of her in a forest in Grabarka in Poland when she was an Orthodox nun, to now photographing her in a very new chapter of her life in France. So there's a big twist to the story, which you can probably guess, but I'm not going to make it explicit.
We won't put any spoilers.
Something major happened. Yes,
yes, well, I can guess, but we won't put spoilers.
As with life, something happened.
Something major happened in her life that we were not expecting, and to a certain extent, she wasn't expecting. And her life has taken a huge turn, and we've documented that as well. So there's kind of a third chapter to the story we weren't expecting.
And that's one of those things too, like especially like when you start to get involved with somebody, like it's never just photographing someone if you're doing a documentary, because you inevitably, if they're going to allow you into their lives, you're going to see things that they typically in the long run would never have really shown people. And as long as you treat those moments with respect, then this trust builds. And all of a sudden, when those unexpected moments happen, like you said, like there's a twist, as M. Night Shyamalan would say, and you're there, it's just natural to allow you to be there and be in your own way, be a part of it. Because I mean, do you find when like over the course of this documentary, right, which you didn't expect to be a full length thing, it's a little difficult not to be just an observer, isn't it? Because you're there to document, but then you get to know them. You're there with there's really intimate moments, and when the camera's not up, you can't pretend that you didn't just experience that with them.
It's a very difficult role, because I think obviously a photograph is generally more fleeting in terms of the actual image making. Right. With a film, I'm spending long periods of time in the monastery around Vera, and I'm learning about her all the time. And there is this kind of building of a relationship and essentially a friendship. But there's also a line there, like, you know, as a documentary maker, what line do you draw between being very invested in that person emotionally and actually beginning to, you know, care about them as a friend, as a confidant, but also needing to get what you have to get for the film and for the footage. So it's quite, and this is very new to me, because this is the first time I'd been involved in filmmaking. So it feels very different from being a photographer in that sense. Like, I always feel as a photographer that I have a kind of duty of care, if you like when I'm photographing someone, it's very important to me that they're photographed with dignity, they're photographed with respect. And I take I take a lot of care over composing the photograph and how I present that person. And with the film, it's a kind of on a different layer, because you're invested in their life in a different way. And actually what was interesting with the film is that when this like life-changing decision happened, initially she didn't want us to film her. So it was very difficult, because we knew that this was so fascinating and interesting and kind of brilliant for the film, but it was also an incredibly kind of raw time in her life, and she was very vulnerable, and she didn't know what direction her life was going to take, and she didn't want us around. And it's like, how do you persuade, you kind of want to persuade them that they should allow you into their life, but at the same time, you want to give them space to be able to be comfortable with the decision they've made. So it was a very much this kind of steep learning curve for me, and how you deal with these very personal relationships, which you never really expect to get to that point. Like when I first met her and I first photographed her, it was half an hour, yet she had this kind of quite, I would say, profound and powerful effect on me. I didn't know if I would ever see her again. Now, you know, she was texting me yesterday. We're in contact a lot and we're leaving each other voice messages. And it's just very, I mean, in lots of ways, it's very fascinating how your kind of role shifts. But obviously, there's an element of you that wants to stay kind of objective. And if you become too subjective, then there's going to be a bias there, or you're going to be representing her in a kind of skewed way. So yes, it's been challenging in some ways to make that shift between photographer and filmmaker. And as her life has made this very dramatic kind of change, like I followed her with the co-director, we've made a decision that we want to follow her. But it actually, in the end, I had to very directly say to her, this is what we want for the film. And are you prepared to give us that? Are you prepared to work with us and collaborate on this? Because this is what we want to do. And we feel your story is so important. And in the end, she said yes, but it was almost like this negotiation process that I hadn't really had to do so much with photography.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I've got a background in photojournalism and emphasis in documentary photography, and I hadn't really thought before about the difference between like doing a documentary with still versus documentary with video or film. Not still. I don't know what the current term is for is that movie? Is it that? I don't even know.
Image or film. Or...
Yeah, you know. And when you're shooting stills, like you're in there, you're there for those moments. Sometimes you're obnoxiously close with a wide angle lens, but you feel invested. But at the same time, I guess you're right. You do have the ability to sort of like be a bit more in the background. Whereas with a video camera, like an audio. Like it's much more up in their business. I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for, but much more immediate upon the person you're doing the work of on. So that's really interesting. I have to sort of think that, because I've always thought of documentary photography being much the same way you described as video, but you've done both, and you're saying video is much more intense and immediate. And
well, I mean, maybe not always, but for me, it's turned into a different level of responsibility, because I've never done a photography project and obviously some photographers do, but up until now, my encounters with people in photography have been relatively fleeting. Okay. So I've spotted someone, or I've seen someone, or I've wanted to tell their story, but it's been something that's been over a relatively short amount of time. Okay. So it's not comparable to building a relationship with someone over like 4 years. And of course, some photographers do work in that way. They'll work with a family or one person over a number of years. But up until now, that wasn't the way I worked in terms of my image making. So it is a different way of working, and you're kind of uncovering layers, and it feels to me that I'm getting like deeper into someone in a way that my photography, and whether this is part of using a large format camera as well. For me, when I use a large format camera, what I enjoy about it is that there's a connection, but there's also some kind of distance. So you need to engage with them on one level, but there's also a kind of slight barrier, and it's not exactly a disconnect, but there's something there that's almost preventing you from going too close. And part of that is the time it takes to set up, the consideration, the precision that you need. Filming, like a lot of the time, we were just following her life as it was happening. So in a sense, although a lot of the film is, framed very carefully, it's composed very carefully, and it's an extension of Ex Voto, there's also moments that are much more where we're just going with the moment. And that's something that I'm not used to doing when I'm making my photographs. So it allows you to kind of access someone on a different level. And as a result of that, it feels like there's a bigger responsibility, because like you mentioned, I'm not just telling someone's story through visuals. I'm telling someone's story through their words and through audio and through sound and through soundscape as well. So it's, in some ways, it's a richer way of telling someone's story, but it's also a way of storytelling that you have to be much more kind of careful of, because there's all these elements that are coming together.
Right. And actually that brings me to a question I had looking at your bodies, multiple bodies of work, which are lovely, by the way, like really lovely. It seemed to me that you, starting with Ex Voto and other projects, and now the body of work you're shooting in Northern Italy with dress and culture and whatnot, that you really seem to be drawn to perhaps not necessarily religion, but the ceremony. People who are really involved in even the prom photos, right? These are kids who are like, this is one of the biggest ceremonies of their teenage life, getting the full dress up and the corsage. And so you seem to be really drawn to things that are heavily laden with ceremony of some kind or deeper meaning, religious or otherwise. Mm-hmm. Do you find that your choice of large format camera, you're drawn to that for the same reason? Because large format, as you just said, like it's very ceremonious. You set it up, you take a photo, you pose them, you tell them not to move, whatever. And in and of itself, it's much more of a ceremonious way of taking images than just, grabbing the Sony A7 full frame and popping mm-hmm. off 30 frames. Do you think there's a parallel with that? Or?
Oh, definitely. It's for me, there's a ritual and a rhythm to working with a large format camera. And, I don't know if I'm always going to work with large, I don't know. I'm not saying like I'm always only going to work in 5.4 or 10.8 or whatever. But for the moment, the subject matters that I'm choosing to photograph, whether it's religion and faith or it's tradition and identity, like my more recent project, or like you say, it's these teenagers who've had their kind of rites of passage like stolen from them. There's a kind of ritualistic element to that. And for me, working in large format, it actually becomes quite meditative for me in a sense. I'm not mm-hmm. saying I'm kind of like omming under the cloak, it's not to that extent. But there's a pattern to the way you work, and there's a way you have to think. And I always think with large format, it's so simple, yet there are so many things that can go wrong. The amount of time we've all double exposed or opened the back and not realized, and I mean there's so many, or had the shutter open and taken a shot.
That stopped down off of the preview.
Exactly. Like there's so many things that can easily go wrong, yet on one level it's very simple. So for me, no, certainly it kind of mirrors the rituals and the ceremonies, like you say, that I photograph. For me, that's mirrored in the way I work with large format. But I think also I was thinking recently about why I'm kind of drawn to these notions or these themes of faith and devotion and ritual and identity. And they're things that I don't really have in my life on a daily basis. And I think there's something about that to me is very intriguing and fascinating, and that I learn from. And actually, that's why, for instance, when I first started Ex Voto, I come from, I would say, agnostic or atheist background. I don't come from a religious background, if you like. And so it was quite surprising to my family that I was spending all this time in Lourdes and at these pilgrimage sites. They weren't discouraging of it anyway, but it was, it wasn't an obvious kind of choice for me in terms of topic. But I've realized as I've kind of got older and my work's developed that actually for me, it's always about exploring kind of the unknown. So trying to uncover and understand why people feel this way, why they're motivated by this, what these traditions mean to them. And although my latest project, which is called Gli Isolani, which is the islanders in Italian, it isn't about faith as such, but there are definitely overlaps with Ex Voto in terms of there are certain themes there that kind of connect with belief and with faith and with the relationship between landscape and person, with the relationship between person and their environment. So there are certain themes that are definitely kind of evolving, but that are also kind of common themes to my work. And that even comes down to the teenagers. Like you say, I made a whole series called Lost Summer, and that was documenting teenagers in my neighborhood who'd been, very much affected by COVID, as we all had, and they'd had these big rites of passage kind of taken away from them. So there were no proms anymore. They just left. They kind of left school without really leaving school. They'd just been told not to come back. Their exams had been cancelled. Yeah. And it was a very, very, very odd time for them. And I wanted to document them in a sense to give them their own space and to allow them to kind of have a sense of how they would feel had they gone to their prom. So the idea behind that series was that it was local teenagers dressed up the kind of the prom that had never happened. But even with that, there is a ritual in terms of the dressing up and them getting ready for a photograph and them getting prepared for the photograph. And there is an element of planning, I suppose, in that sense that goes into my image making.
There's I just wanted to take you back in a moment to a link between filmmaking and still photography. But while you're on that subject, proms. When I was at school, we never had proms. Eric, look, it's another thing.
Really?
You people, we never had it. No, it's come over here from too many American movies.
Import. It's an American import.
It is. So I'm not quite sure when it happened. So now you see, when our daughter's 24, son's 25, 26 this year, and both of them had proms. I said, what? What you mean? They've got to go out and buy dresses? Well, he didn't, but he could. I mean, nothing wrong with it. He could have done, but he chose to, have a suit. And Georgia had a prom dress, and they said, well, and you've got to go in a special car. I said, no. I said, well, actually, I can go with someone else. And people are going to all these great lengths, and there's this great ritual and ceremony around it, and it's they're gathering on a lawn outside our the school that they're at, and people were photographing in a very, in the way that you did for your project, and so it's really interesting the way these things have traveled over. And I can't
silly
work out. I can't work out whether it's a good or a bad thing, but I suppose it marks. All these things are marking stages, aren't they? And it's a bit like ritual and tradition. They're things to look back on, and they're things to mark stages in our lives, whatever you think of them as individual ceremonies.
And I think they are really significant for the young people themselves. I mean,
I think so.
I think obviously the prom is a kind of American phenomenon originally, or in terms of it's come to us, I think, from the States. And I'm the same as you, like I didn't have a prom, but we had like a leavers ball at sixth form. And it's an opportunity for people to get together, to celebrate together, to kind of, celebrate their achievements, to celebrate their friendships, to celebrate their communities. And when that's just completely, kind of taken out of the equation, and when that's not allowed to happen, I think there is a real sense of kind of loss there. I mean, I think it can go completely extreme in the same way that weddings can, with people spending £10,000 on dresses and getting stretch limos and that kind of thing. But actually, I suppose I was more interested in the kind of simpler aspect of it, which was the kids just getting dressed up in, their best clothes, if you like, to kind of celebrate together and to mark this occasion together. And when that was taken away from them, that was something that I felt, when I had
you did that. Was that a project in 2020? Was it?
Yes, it was. So that was from, I think June to August 2020, and it was when we were all kind of in and out of lockdown. So at that point, I wasn't able to travel to Italy for the project that was very much in its kind of infancy that I'd started, and I was very frustrated, as a lot of photographers were, with not being able to move on projects that I had started because we weren't able to travel. So I began to look much closer to home, really in my immediate neighborhood. And that was when I started talking to friends I had who had teenage kids, and they were saying how a lot of their children had been stuck in their bedroom for weeks or months, and there was this kind of listlessness and this ennui was setting in, and they felt that they had no purpose. And all the time we were kind of reliant on this 1 hour of outdoor.
Yeah, I know.
We were around. So the parks and these public spaces became very important in that respect. So that was when I got the idea to actually just go around my local neighborhood. And it was the first project I'd done in a while where I was very reliant just on my kind of locality and surroundings. And I think that was very good for me, because I think in the past I've always been like, right, I need to go 2 weeks to Italy to shoot this project, or I need to go to Poland for a week to go to this pilgrimage site. And actually it made me realize, which is no big revelation, but it made me realize that of course there are interesting and fascinating stories on your doorstep if you're open to them. You don't need to jump on a plane to make an interesting photo story. So that's when I started documenting teenagers in my neighborhood who had all had their proms cancelled. And of course with teenagers, like they all went to completely different schools, but there's always this kind of crossover. So half of them used to just hang out at the park together. So a lot of them ended up knowing each other even though I didn't set out to have them all know each other, but there are many connections between the teenagers I photographed. And also I was very conscious, because I live in, it's a very kind of diverse neighborhood, and that needed to be represented through the photography, but that actually happened very kind of naturally. So, one teen would say, oh, you should photograph my friend, and then they'd send me a WhatsApp for them, and then I'd get in touch. So it was a very condensed project, because it was all over 12 weeks. And when people started going back to school, that felt like a natural end to the project. So that's when I kind of stopped shooting, and at that point I'd shot 44 teenagers. And actually I made a decision about that project that I hadn't ever really done before, which was that I didn't edit anyone out. So I shot 44 teenagers, and 44 teenagers are all in the final project and in the book that I self-published, because I felt that they'd been kind of through so much individually and collectively that it just didn't feel right to me to kind of exclude anyone. So as a result, there are portraits. Of course, I've got my favorites. I've got Samuel's one of my favorites. Precious is one of my favorites. I've got these kind of teens who are my favorites, whether that's when I met them, they had a particular impact on me, or the actual final photograph is stronger than others. But I made a decision that although some portraits would perhaps not be visually as strong as others, it was really important to the project overall that every teenager had their kind of place in the project.
Can you imagine being, one or two teenagers who got left out of that project, having already felt like really, missed out on so much.
All your mates are included, and you're not. It just
where are you then?
Oh, yeah.
Where's your photo?
She didn't put me in.
I got edited out of it. No, so and I'm happy with that decision. Yeah.
You entered. I don't know. Was it one photograph? Because I've Samuel, Jack, and Jamila for the Taylor Wessing Photography Portrait Prize. Was it all three of them together, or?
So I actually entered 6 originally, which I believe is I've been doing this for many years and been rejected for many years, so I know the rules by now. So I believe for the Taylor Wessing Portrait Prize, unless they've changed it, you can enter up to 6 portraits, either individual portraits or from a series. So I entered 6, and at that point the project was still in progress, so I hadn't completed it. I can't remember how many teenagers I photographed at that point, but I entered 6, and then 3 were selected as the first prize in the project. So Jack, who was the first person I ever photographed for the project, who is my friend's daughter's now ex-boyfriend, because actually there were quite a few couples, they've all broken up by now, not unsurprisingly when you're 16 or 17. Jack and Samuel and Jamila were the ones that they picked as the 3 that became the kind of winning portraits.
Out of curiosity, when I look at the images you have out of the 44, I think you have maybe 8 or 9 on your website. Is all the kids look, with the exception, I think, of one who has like she has a little bit of a half smile, but all of them are quite serious, deadpan to serious as they look at the camera. And from my experience, proms, that sort of thing, there's sometimes a bit of hamming up, and I don't know if that's because like you were with a couple or with a group. Did most of the kids have that sort of serious, like gravitas sort of expression, or did some vary? And if it was all serious, was it a reflection of the times they were in, or like how did that come about? Because they're all just very like,
they are quite serious. I mean, I suppose in a way it was reflected of the times that they were going through and what they were experiencing. So they weren't particularly kind of joyous times for them, because they had been missing out on a lot. So it would have been weird to have photographed them all kind of with huge grins on their
Why
face.
aren't you smiling?
But also I suppose I wanted to represent a kind of strength, like an inner strength, and maybe a defiance and a kind of resilience. But I also wanted them I hope some of them would also be hopeful, because actually what I found when I met them was that they were full of ambition for the future, even though their summer had kind of been taken away from them. And that's why the project was called Lost Summer. But also with my portraits, there is an element of direction. So I'm saying to them, I want you to really think about what you've been going through with this summer, and the losses you felt, or how, I want you to express visually like how you felt in the last few months. And I don't say to them, right, look at the camera, and when I, press do the cable release, I want you to smile. I want them to be I want them to be these kind of thoughtful portraits that you're really trying to figure out what these young people are going through. So some of it, I think, was how they were anyway, but also some of it is kind of directed from me to a certain extent. I can't pretend that I don't have any influence on, but in terms of like what they were wearing, or I had no control or say. I didn't want to, in terms of, I didn't tell them what to wear. I didn't tell them how to do their hair or anything like that. But what I did decide was that I would photograph them all in these kind of natural surroundings. So they were almost framed by the trees or the local park or their backyards. So, there's a really wide range of teenagers there. Some of them are from, I would consider to be wealthy, privileged backgrounds. Others are from very deprived backgrounds. And I didn't want you to make any judgment when you looked at them as to, their class or their kind of socio-economic status. And that was why I felt that the kind of outdoor spaces, whether it was their gardens or the local parks, it felt more kind of democratic for me to photograph them there. But yes, there's always, ultimately, I suppose, as a photographer, I am in control to an extent of representation, of how I represent my subjects. But for this, it wouldn't have felt right if they'd all been kind of beaming at the camera, because there was a sadness to what they'd gone through, and there was, it was a serious time for everyone. So I was trying to reflect that in the images.
And that's a challenge too. I've been trying to do more portraits lately because I feel like I'm awful at them, and people square up to the camera and they just go, and they put this this like middle school in America. We have these painful school portraits at certain middle school, and all of them are put in our family's albums, and we just look like we're just have these plastic, painful, frozen expressions that are just god awful. We call them the middle school face, right? And it's just like, stop. As a photographer, you're just like, one, it's so artificial looking, and two, just stop. Just don't. Unless you really want to smile, I don't want that smile. I want you to be you. Because the reflex is like, for people who are listening to the podcast, I'm doing this like square up really cheesier than I usually am.
But it's the Instagram selfie generation as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, they're very good at this. We shouldn't just paint a broad brush, but they are to a certain extent more aware of.
That's true.
Like my son is 15. I'm more aware of that sort of visualization because of social media, I think, than our generation was, definitely. Without question, because they grew up with social media being a genuine factor. And when we were growing up, that was not ever a thing. Like, we never really had to worry about our appearance.
That's true. And I was worried actually with a lot of them in terms of I was concerned about whether they would like their portraits, because obviously I'm not applying any filters. I'm not, photoshopping them. It's very natural. I don't do retouching. So I was a little bit concerned if some of them would be a bit like, oh no, I really hate that because I look really serious and I haven't got, a filter. Right. And I think some of them probably didn't love their portraits, but I know others were really, they enjoyed the process of it, and they liked, they'd never seen a camera like that before. They were really fascinated by the process, and they appreciated the kind of craft involved in that. So ultimately it felt like the right way to work. But I also think that your personality as a photographer often comes through in terms of the portraits you take. And, I don't know how I would describe myself. It's really hard to do that. But I would say I'm a kind of quietly confident person. And when I'm photographing, I'm extremely focused on what I'm doing. And I probably am quite serious, and I'm not kind of goofing around behind the camera and like doing loads of gestures and faces. And I think people respond to that. So, you can see some photographers who are much kind of bigger personalities. They're more gregarious, they're more playful. And as a result, some of the portraits they make, reflect that. So I think to a certain extent, it's difficult to say exactly because it's hard to assess how you are as a personality. I do think for me that the subjects I choose to photograph and the way I choose to photograph people particularly, and landscapes as well, there's a kind of quietness there that is a part of me as well. It wouldn't say I'm a really quiet personality, but there's elements of me that I think come through in the final image, and it's not always easy to identify exactly what they are. But I think the way I work when I'm behind the camera, particularly with a large format camera, you're on a tripod, you've got everything set up, you have to be very precise and very careful. And the people who I'm photographing, they recognize that and they respond to that. And as a result, they're patient and they're still and they're quiet and they're thoughtful. And these are all kind of characteristics that I think I employ when I'm making a photograph.
Right. I'll just share this one sort of anecdotal story, because I struggle. Like, I find myself trying to, like, taking portraits, trying to get some expression out of people that isn't fake, but is more real. And so I found myself like doing a little banter, like you said, little banter with people, and like bad dad jokes. Being a dad, I have a lot of bad dad jokes.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started looking at the portraits, being like, a lot of these folks, they're smiling, they look natural, they look great, that's awesome, but that's not always the situation they're in. So like this whole banter thing is like you said, casting artificial end product on the image. That's a reflection of my discomfort trying to get them to have behind the camera engaging with someone, and therefore trying to get them to have a better expression to make me more comfortable. And that was a more reflection of myself and my process than it was their actual state of being at that point in time. And so I'd look at these portraits and be like, is this actually them, or is this just me getting a reaction out of them that I'm hoping to get a reaction out of to make me more comfortable in an uncomfortable situation?
Not only take yourself out of a portrait.
Yeah.
As a photographer,
yeah,
I think there's always going to be an element of you that is in that portrait.
Right. So the last event that I photographed, I do a lot of cycling events. It's my background. Is I would just try to tell people like to close your eyes, relax your face, and think about a thing, like what you've gone through, what you're going to go through, what's going to feel like when you're done, whatever that is. And like one at a count of three, open your eyes and look at the camera and show that. Mm-hmm. And then the reactions from that technique were much different, because it centered them in themselves, where they were at that moment, great physical exertion, emotional exhaustion, depending on what the scenario was. And it got a much wider, what felt to me more natural range of reaction, because I tried to center it on them and not on me and my banter and like performing, as you said.
Yeah.
And it was a much more interesting process to go through.
When I was a kid on Great Yarmouth Seafront, Eric, you won't know where Great Yarmouth is.
I know, but I want to now.
They used to have guys with monkeys. Can you imagine that? And and they'd put a monkey on your shoulder, and you know,
and you'd be like,
taking. Yeah. How about that? I don't know where that came from. That memory just suddenly came into my head. Yeah, performance. Yeah. So Alys, when you've been heavily invested in the dragging you back before we get onto your most recent project in the last 20 minutes or so. The filmmaking, which you're going to do some rough screening this evening, you can hope that all goes well, and you can tell us a bit more about when we might be able to see that in a while. So this was your first experience into filmmaking, and it happened over quite a long time, and you got heavily invested in it. How do you think, if at all, it's then affected, say, your Lost Summer project and then your Islanders project? Did it have any influence on the way you made those portraits compared with your original Ex Voto images?
I don't think so, because obviously with the film I'm using Sony equipment. I'm co-directing. It's made me realise that I'm really bad at collaboration.
Oh right, that's interesting.
Not bad, that doesn't come naturally to me, because with my previous projects I've had total control. I've decided on the subject matter. I've decided exactly how I want to frame it. I decided on the edit and the sequencing. And then suddenly co-directing a film where you're working in a team, albeit a very small team, because we're working on kind of a shoestring budget. So there's basically me, a co-director, a producer, an editor. You're having to make concessions. You're having to make compromises. You're having to film things that you don't always want to film or that you don't think are right. So it's a hugely different process in terms of co-directing. I think if I had been just directing on my own, it's perhaps different. But also the filmmaking was something that I just didn't expect to happen. So although I've always loved film, I've loved cinematography, I've spent a lot of time, watching film and reading about film. It was never something that I thought I would do, or even that really appealed to me. It happened because of this serendipitous meeting with Vera, the nun. And that's why it developed into what it has developed into, which is a feature-length documentary film. But yes, for me, it's a very different process. So in terms of the work I'm making now, I don't think the film has influenced it that much, other than for me to realize that I'm better when I'm working on my own and I have full creative control, really, because it's been very challenging for me on a personal level having to collaborate, essentially.
So you haven't thought about homing in on a family or a group of people within your community and developing a long-term project, employing that, like the relationship you built up with Vera, but with people closer to home? That's not something that appeals to you?
It's not that it doesn't appeal. I feel that that's not the way I work photographically very successfully. So it's worked with the film, and that's perhaps been partly through circumstance than anything else. But I enjoy these fleeting encounters, and the research is a big part of all my projects. I mean, not so much for Lost Summer, but with Ex Voto and with the recent project Gli Isolani, where I am documenting, other cultures or other aspects of people's kind of human condition that I can't relate to on an immediate level. Like the research that's gone into that, whether it's been through literature or poetry or academia, that's been really important to me. And what I enjoy is doing the research and then visiting these places and seeing what happens when I'm there. But it doesn't necessarily translate to spending huge amount of times there. But also there is a practical kind of and logistical consideration, which is when I've been filming the film, which is now called Mother Vera, last January, the co-director and I went to Belarus for 6 weeks to stay in the monastery. Now that for me was massive, because I've never spent 6 weeks solidly on a photographic project, because I'm always worried, how am I going to pay the bills? How am I going to pay the mortgage? I work as a commercial photographer. So for me, that was huge. And actually what's been difficult working in film is that the co-director, who is incredibly talented and very dedicated, is like, you have to give up your life for this film. This is how filmmaking works. You cannot have anything else going on in your life. And because I've almost fallen into filmmaking, my point of view is, well, that's not a decision I made. I made a decision to be a photographer where I can spend a week here and 2 weeks here and a week here and build it around my other schedule. So it's been very difficult. And I have realized that to be a true kind of documentary filmmaker, well, not a true, but to be successful in that respect, or to follow these people's stories, you have to be instinctive, and you have to be able to drop everything. And I don't think I'm necessarily willing to do that, I suppose. And which is why with my photographic projects, I'm very focused. So with my latest project, for instance, Gli Isolani, the Islanders, I'm documenting kind of rituals and ceremonies and costumes in the Venetian islands in the north of Italy, but also in Sicily and Sardinia. And for those, they were very much planned out, the shoots, and I would go for like a week, 10 days, 2 weeks at a time, and then I would come back and kind of assess what I had. So filmmaking the way that filmmaking works in terms of the level of, it's not really commitment, because I'm very committed to my photographic projects, but the fact that everything has to revolve around the film, like nothing else can get in the way. You have to be, that has to come first, above and beyond everything. And I don't think I'm at a stage in my life where I'm not going to like go and live in a van so I can make a documentary film, whereas perhaps my co-director would. So this is where there are differences, and this is where I feel that perhaps these projects where you have to immerse yourself for weeks and months and years at a time are not right for me at this stage in my life.
Right. And that's very documentary photography as well. Like if you look at like what a lot of documentary photographers do, they embed themselves in those lives for days to weeks on end, and then they come up, because if you're not there when something happens, you missed it. Yeah. You can't schedule those things.
Yeah.
And so it may make sense that especially with that balance that a lot of photographers nowadays have to do between editorial and commercial, that you have to do commercial stuff to pay the bills, and you have these little slices of time for the work that means something to you. You can't be like, I can't show up to this commercial shoot or do this, I miss this work I'm being paid to do that will pay my mortgage, because this really special thing is happening with this documentary subject that I'm doing. That's a tough balance.
It is. And, I have huge amounts of respect as well for photographers and artists who are willing to do anything for their work. Absolutely. And I think in some ways, my co-director would have liked us to, for instance, lived in a monastery in Belarus for 6 months or so. And I can see why, because we did miss things because we weren't there the whole time. But for me, I couldn't be there the whole time, or I made it just wasn't practical for many, many reasons. And that's why my photographic projects, I kind of plan in advance when I'm going to make the work. And for me, I'm in a different headspace when I'm doing that. And that's how it works for me. But as you say, if I was working very much in a documentary or reportage way, I don't know, documenting a family or a community in that way over months or years, you do then feel that to get to the level you want to get to, you do need to kind of be with them the whole time and live with them. And that's not the kind of work that I feel like I make with this.
Totally can't blame you, by the way.
Alys, I'm very conscious of timings, and I know you've got to go off for your screening, and we do want to cover. I'm glad you've said it a few times now, because I was fretting over the pronunciation of the islands. So I think you pronounced it Gli Isolani.
So for Italian,
GLI something, isn't it?
Gli Isolani, which is the island.
So it sounds intriguing. Tell us. I know it's been the subject of a now successful Kickstarter, and it's being published by Ghost Books. I know the pronunciation is GOST, which is the same as Ex Voto, and it's going to be. I think you're still taking pre-orders, I believe, but you can correct me. And it's going to be published later in this year. But tell us about how that project came about, and your just tell us about it, Alys, because it sounds fascinating.
Yes. So the project came about. I actually had an idea many years ago when I was a kind of travel photographer. I used to do a lot of work for the Time Out travel guides I may have mentioned before. Oh. And I was sent all over the place for these, North America and Europe mostly. And I would have to spend probably about a month in each city. And I got to know the cities very well because I was walking everywhere for kind of hours on end every single day of the month, taking photographs of everything from sightseeing and different neighborhoods and bars and restaurants and all that kind of stuff. So I got to know these places quite well in quite a short space of time. And I remember I was doing the Time Out guide to Venice, and I actually had to go back 2 or 3 times because I did the guides over several years when they reprinted them. And I remember the kind of idea for the project originally came when I was in Venice, and I was waiting for a vaporetto, which is obviously the boat, which is the public form of transport there. And I had been asked to photograph. Time Out used to give me a huge list that I used to kind of work my way through in terms of the photographs. And on this list was a cemetery island called San Michele, which is, what I said it is. So it's an island that is a huge cemetery, but it's very atmospheric because it's set apart from the kind of main part of Venice. And I remember waiting for the vaporetto, and it was kind of enveloped in this mist, and there were all these Venetians clutching flowers going to get the boat to the cemetery island to lay flowers at the graves of their loved ones. And I just found this an incredibly kind of moving and evocative scene. And I thought, well, maybe it would be wonderful to start photographing people who travel over by boat, Venetians over by boat, to the cemetery island to lay flowers. So I started in my head, I almost already had the name for the project, which at that point I'd called it The Mourners, which I can't remember what that is in Italian. Anyway, so then I kind of had this idea for a project. This was 20 years ago. So 20 years later, I think, kind of pre-pandemic, well, maybe I should revisit this idea, because often these ideas linger in my head for many years or decades in this case. And I began to explore San Michele, the cemetery island, but also these islands that have kind of been abandoned in the Venetian lagoon and that are essentially kind of crumbling into the water. And many of them are old psychiatric hospitals and old military bases.
That's amazing.
And they've got this hugely interesting history because of the history of people coming to Venice and invading Venice and the rules of Venice and the different cultures. So, they've all got their individual kind of histories, and with that, it's caught up in memory and identity and what it means to be a Venetian and all this kind of stuff. But this was about 3 years ago, and I soon realized that, first of all, I kind of worried about, am I going to get really depressed photographing people who are mourning? But also, then I thought, but also kind of what gives me the right to photo? I always am questioning, what gives me the right to photograph these people? Like, I always feel like I have to justify it on a personal level. And I really started questioning my motivation for this. So it then I started looking at the different annual festivities and celebrations that happen in Venice. which are often based, of course, on religion and faith and saints. So I started investigating that. And then that took me, through my research, that took me down kind of further south in Italy to Sicily and to Sardinia. And that's when I just discovered these incredible costumes and masks that are worn often with kind of during annual festivities. A lot of them are based on Holy Week, which is Settimana Santa, or Pasqua, which is Easter. So a lot of these costumes are brought out for these celebrations, but then many are also influenced by pagan traditions and folklore and kind of fables and fairy tales. And they're these kind of fantastical characters that emerge. So what happens is the local villages, particularly in Sicily and Sardinia, and we're talking about tiny villages here in the kind of quite obscure hilltop villages. So they're not in the big cities. I mean, some of them happen in the big cities, but the ones I explored were a little bit more obscure. And I started through my research to find these amazing costumes that had been passed down through generations and that really spoke of the relationship between kind of man and the land and good and evil and the cycle of life and the seasons. And the more research I did, the more kind of amazed I was that these were still in existence and that were still so important to these communities. So a project that started about mourners in Venice kind of morphed into a project about, which is now called Gli Isolani, the Islanders, about identity and the kind of retaining of these traditions in these small villages, mostly in Sicily and Sardinia. So yeah, that was the kind of idea. I mean, often with my photographic projects, I start with an idea and then it kind of doesn't quite go in the direction I'm expecting. So I sometimes have to revise what I'm thinking. But a lot of this also came through research of literature and poetry and looking at films and reading historical kind of books and watching documentaries and stuff like that. So it was a kind of, it was a merging of all these influences that kind of made the idea more concrete for me, I suppose.
We could talk for another hour on this, I know. And, but Simon asked me to ask you. Mm-hmm. I think he was a bit worried that he'd sent you off last time we spoke. You may not remember. He started talking about lenses, and you were using your Sinar f2, was it, and 150mm lens.
Yeah.
And he said, I think we maybe talked about got her thinking about gear too much, and maybe she got a bit worried that. But I think you had lots of other stuff as well. But did you then go off and Simon said you went off and bought a Chamonix or a field camera? Is that what you're now
using? How does he know that?
I've no idea. I said, how did you know that? And maybe he's been spying on you clearly more than I have.
No, I did, because my Sinar rather was great. I mean, I've said this before. I don't feel I'm particularly kind of techie, but it was great. But essentially, I was lugging around a studio camera.
I know. Yeah.
In a wheelie suitcase, and it wasn't particularly practical. So after I completed Ex Voto, I thought, okay, let me invest in something that's a little bit more manageable in terms of carrying it for long distances, and that is, it folds down, a field camera. So I ended up buying a Chamonix, and I still obviously use the same. I've still only got one lens.
Good for you.
I use one lens for everything, whether it's landscapes or portraits. I mean, I have a backup, but they're the same focal length.
Yeah, no, and I think for all the same reasons we spoke about in the first show, I think it's laudable that you're using only one lens. And Simon was trying to get you to buy an Aero Ektar or some other swirly type lens.
I think I do like the swirly ones, but it's difficult. I mean, it's difficult with my photography. I love the tonality, the depth that you get with large format, absolutely, and I love the way it makes me think. I also am aware that I don't want to go too far down the kind of effects route in some ways. So the kind of photography I'm doing anyway, because essentially the photography I'm doing it's documentary, but I don't know, you could call it fine art documentary or portrait.
Documentary.
Documentary. I don't want to be too reliant on the kind of effects. I want to be using that format because it suits the way I work and it suits my subject matters, but I also don't want to be too swayed by the kind of lens effects and stuff like that. It's just the subject.
That's enough about gear. We don't.
The Chamonix has been great. Just in case.
So, have you found the Kickstarter process, and just tell us about the commercial side of it and how that's gone and going, and when the book being published, and that sort of stuff.
So the book, which is called Gli Isolani, The Islanders, will be out in the autumn or the fall for anyone American, and will be published by Goss Books again. I did have to do a Kickstarter, which I was very much hoping. Well, I didn't want to do another Kickstarter because I did a Kickstarter for Ex Voto, but unfortunately, I may have mentioned this before. This is kind of the model that a lot of independent photo book publishers are. Well, they're not requiring you to do a Kickstarter, but they're requiring the photographer to stump up money. So essentially, it's on risk for them. Now, having already published Ex Voto with Ghost, I didn't have to raise anywhere near as much money as I did for Ex Voto. So, in a sense, that was good. But also, there are realistic costs, like cost of paper has gone up by 40%, for instance. Like, obviously, there's import issues with post-Brexit. So there's lots of factors that have meant that basically producing photo books is more expensive now than it ever has been. Now, the Kickstarter model for photographers is something that I'm quite vocal about in terms of I don't think it's a good model. I don't think it's a healthy model for photographers. I don't think it should really be required. But I also kind of understand on one level why the photography publishers feel it's necessary to ask the photographer to contribute, but I don't think it's a good thing. But at the same time, with this book, the work feels like, in some ways, I feel it could be the most important work I ever make for me. Well, who knows? But at the moment, it feels like it's very important as a body of work. Therefore, I didn't feel confident self-publishing this body of work. Like, I did self-publish Lost Summer, the teenage book, but that was a much kind of simpler book, I suppose, in terms of the production. And this, I felt that I wanted to go with a publisher I'd worked with before. They deal with the distribution, with the marketing, with the press, so with the, everything. So I don't have to, once I have got a certain amount of money, I don't have to really.
What about with like design, for example?
Yeah, they do the design. And Stu Gost is a very well-known designer. So we're nearly at the end of finishing the design, and I'm confident it will be a beautiful book and the production quality will be very nice. And they include the design in that. So they kind of essentially do everything. But I think for new photographers, it's kind of unfair, like it was for me for Ex Voto, to have to ask a photographer who is struggling financially to come up with £18,000 or plus £20,000. It's an awful lot of money. It's a huge amount of money. And I know it's very hard to make a profit in photo books, but I also think it's not a model that should be. I don't want to kind of be an advocate for it. But at the same time, I know I'm being a hypocrite because I have kind of done another Kickstarter, even though I vowed I never would. So I'm pretty sure this is going to be my last Kickstarter. Well, I think 2 is enough in anyone's lifetime. Well, so
folks can still place. Sorry, Alice. Folks can still place pre-orders. I think I had a little poke around on there because I missed the Kickstarter, but I did look on the order. Yeah.
So pre-orders are available via my website, alystomlinson.co.uk, and will also be available on the Ghost website soon. And really, pre-orders are a way of, obviously, people buy the book in advance, and that allows you to have the money for the production. So
exactly.
Well, it'll be a limited run because Ex Voto is out of print now, and
it's sold out. And it's going for kind of silly money. So
which is a way to push for having a second run, right?
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, there may be.
Just saying,
Yeah. We have kind of thought about it, so maybe in the future. We'll see, but at the moment, I'm focused on this new body of work, and I'm excited about it. There's already it's going to be shown in Italy, which is where I really wanted it to be shown. I think in Palermo next year. It's being shown in another part of South Sicily in the summer. So I'm at the moment really hoping it will be
London in September. Did I read 7th of September somewhere?
So that's right. Yeah. So the beginning from the 7th of September till the end of October, there's an exhibition of the work that will be shown at Huckleberry Fine Art, which is in Kensington in London, which is the gallery who represents me. So there'll be a solo show of the work there. Yeah.
Julie and I have a weekend in London that very weekend.
That's good timing.
Yeah, that very weekend we're staying just near the Tate Modern for a couple of nights. So
you'll be jealous.
We hope to call in.
Yes, please do.
And finally, the film, is that going on general release, limited release? Because I know these sort of documentary things probably won't be at your local view, will they? No.
Well, it might be at your local art house eventually.
That would be awesome.
So there's a whole procedure in terms of festivals for these kind of arty documentaries whereby we have to not pitch them, but we propose them or apply to certain festivals. We're hoping it will be done by the autumn, and it may be out in festivals in the new year, but who knows. But we are hoping for cinematic release, but it's not going to be at like the Odeon Leicester Square or whatever. Like it will be limited, I think.
I was hoping for my invite.
Yeah, you will get an invite, but it may not be to a major cinema. But we'll have to see. I mean, this is a new world for me, so it's all about. Like,
it's weird too. Like all the film festivals, when you do a documentary, like, will you be premiering it? We only want movies that will be premiering with us.
Exactly. So you have to be quite strategic about who you apply to. So you end up ideally want to end up
and being backed by Sundance, though, isn't there a chance that you have a leg up to getting it into and premiering at Sundance?
Well, that would be the dream, but actually having been supported by them, there's no guarantee, they say.
Right.
So that's probably going to be one of our first choices, but we may be a bit high. I don't know. We'll have to see. I don't know at the moment. It all feels a little bit out of our hands to a certain extent. But yes, we're hoping it will premiere at ideally a big-ish festival in the new year. Yeah, cool. And then on to release.
Okay, so we'll let you go here. We said we'd stick to an hour, and
we've kept you 3 minutes over.
It's been a wonderful pleasure to have you back on again.
Thank you for having me.
If the book is anywhere near, or the body of work is anywhere near as powerful as Ex Voto, it's going to be a surefire winner. And I look forward to seeing some of it in the flesh in London.
Yeah, that'd be great.
God willing.
I'm looking forward to the movie too. Actually, I'm very excited to see that.
Thank you. Yes. Well, thank you for having me, and I'll leave you to it then.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we'll have you on perhaps again. When the movie's released or when other things happen.
If the film was ever released, I can come on and talk.
Oh, it will be. It will.
So, okay. Bye now.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a good screening.
Bye. Thank you.
Well, wasn't that fantastic? It's a shame we didn't have Alys for longer, because I'd like to have spent more time about the kind of relationships and things she developed with those islanders. But wow, there we go.
Cool. Yeah, well, and I mean, that's not to say we couldn't have. We do have a track record of having people back again. Witness me. Sorry, folks. I just don't go away. But yeah, absolutely. And I'm also super curious. I didn't get a chance to ask, and now she gets to think about before we ambush her with the questions again. But having gone through like what she had to learn visually shooting video, cinematic is a completely different format often, and whether or not when she came back to other projects it changed how she sees and frames things. Perhaps not how she works, because she said it didn't really change how she worked, but how she sees things.
That would have been another bolt-on question, really. I didn't think of that at the time, but I was very conscious that we had to get onto Gli Isolani as well.
Yeah, and those are also stunning. Those are stunning portraits.
So, folks, look out for that and place some pre-orders with her.
Yeah, because for sure.
She produces some stunning work. So we've got a couple of things to talk about before we wrap up, Eric. I want to talk a little bit about focusing screens.
Oh,
and you can talk a little bit about what you've been up to. We haven't done this what you've been up to thing for a while, but you know. We've only had an hour of recording, so
what the hell have I been up to?
You've been photographing on this gravel. What's it called? The gravel
cycling thing? Yeah.
And you dropped a camera and you broke it. And you've been producing lots of wide angle, sharp center, blurry outside stuff, which must be some kind of inappropriate homemade lens.
Inappropriate, perfectly appropriate, sir.
So tell us all about that project then. What the camera was and what's been involved in the photography.
Well, I've been shockingly sorry, folks. I've been shockingly non-large format lately.
It's okay.
I think mostly because context time for the non-cyclists out there in the world, of which there probably are a lot. Anyways, for context for non-cyclists, cycling itself as a sport and as an industry has been dominated by people like Andrew and I for forever, basically white guys with disposable income. And it hasn't really varied from that track for probably over 100 years. So lately, there's been this emergence for the last 10 years of a venue for cycling called gravel, where you just get on a gravel road and you go. And it's been very approachable because any type of bike can do it. And you just throw a race or a bike event that's on gravel, and anyone can come and they can ride. There's no barriers per se. And the people who've organized them have been very inclusive from the get-go, and inviting people who normally aren't seen in cycling events or in the cycling industry. Like bicycling advertises to fit white men and a little bit to fit white women, and that's kind of it. Not to get political about it, but that's actually, it's more societal. And then all of a sudden, this gravel thing started happening in the last 10 years, and you see people of color, you see people of diverse backgrounds, folks who've never felt welcome in cycling before, suddenly coming out in droves. And it's actually expanded cycling, not just in its demographic, but in what could be like for the cycling corporations, what they can sell into whom. And so it's been the first genuine expansion of bicycling in its demographic and in its sales, right? Because every time a new segment of cycling comes up, it's just poaching from other older segments, like mountain biking, just poached from road biking, but it's the same people hopping from different types, right?
Isn't it the stereotype was, do you have the acronym MAMILs where you are? Middle-aged men in Lycra?
Yes, exactly. And they
white middle-aged men.
Yep. And the mammals would just hop from road bikes to mountain bikes to adventure bikes, but it's the same people, just the same slice of the pie. And all of a sudden the pie got much, much bigger. Yeah. But then the cycling industry had to grapple with its own incredible whiteness and bias and a million other things. And it's been really interesting to watch really conservative companies, really conservative corporations scramble to catch up, to be like, oh, well, we're sponsoring a Black rider, we're sponsoring a gay person, we're going to do a non-binary event, and people who aren't skinny, and like they're scrambling to keep up, because if they don't, they're going to get punished. And so it's been really, really interesting to go to these events and see like a media scrum around a bunch of non-binary
you'd rather they did it. You'd rather they did it with the right heart, wouldn't you, rather than as a marketing exercise?
Yeah, exactly. And the interesting thing too is doing not photography, but interviews with people who are involved in all this, and some of them pointed out like former pro world tour bike racers who came up through like the typical, I'm a white kid from an upper middle class background whose dad was a pro racer, like through that development channel, which most professional cyclists come through. To hear him say like, well, actually, there's a lot of good people who work in the bicycle industry who want to see these changes happen, but they have to sort of make this financial point to the upper level of corporations that this is the money they need to spend. We want them to do it for the good reasons, but in order to justify it, we have to justify it for the financial reasons. And so this has given them the excuse to drive the change they've always wanted to make, but haven't been able to. And so it's just been an interesting thing. But in order to photograph that and whatnot, I've not used large format. I've been using initially like 30. Well, I did some large format. I take that back. Like some of the stuff I've been using large format for, but also 35 millimeter for portraits. And then I think because of the Adobe experience, a combination of the Adobe experience and also my long love of panoramics from Joseph Kudelka, which if you haven't seen his panoramic work, go see it. His panoramic. Well,
the stuff he did in Israel and places like that in the Holy Land. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I'm sure everybody who listens to the podcast, all 5 of you, are kind of tired of me waxing poetic about Joseph Kudelka.
Yeah, we've mentioned him once or twice.
Yeah, his documentary style panoramics are mind blowing. And so I sort of also have always wanted to explore that for like literally decades. I've wanted to do that. And I picked up, but because I make handmade lenses, it's really difficult. Most panoramic cameras are zone focus, even the high end, like the Fuji 617s, zone focus. And it's hard to make a handmade lens that is accurately zone focused, like on one of those cameras. So I found the Graflex 3A SLR, the early 1900s first generation SLRs, all large format. And that camera shoots postcard, 5.5 inch wide, or 14 centimeters for you folks who are sane enough to not use the empirical. And you can convert them to shoot 6x14. with an essentially a giant boxy SLR to shoot medium format panoramics. And that's what I did.
Yeah.
And it was awesome until it dropped out of the truck at the last race in Kansas. And for those of you who know Graflexes, you know, they're essentially, it's a big wooden box. And if that big wooden box gets out of square, then the mirror won't go up and the curtain won't go because it's no longer parallel. It just jams. So it fell out of the pickup truck.
Oh,
hit hard. I just knocked the entire box out of square. And that
did
was
you cry?
I had a really hard time not crying. It was 2/3 of the way through the day. And honestly, it was the first time that camera had just been working. It'd been a little cranky. It's like the grease was old, and like it would be times that it wouldn't shoot because it was cold or whatever. And I'd finally gotten to the place where it was just like just shooting. It was just shooting perfectly, no matter what time of day, no matter what temperature. It was just it was perfect. And it's the first time the thing, like after like literally 6 months of work to get it to the place where I needed it to be. First time, and it's dead.
So you were
2/3 of the way through the fucking day too. So I had to stop and like something else.
Were you using the ortho type film or whatever it was you were using before?
That I was shooting HP5 for an HP5 because I could pull it and push it.
This was a paid gig, was it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
So
well done.
Yeah. So it was that, and that work is up too, by the way. I can put it in the link, but that work is up. So
I think you've been sharing bits of it on Instagram and whatever, and into Facebook groups and things.
Yeah, that work is up at the Radivist. And also the other side note of having that camera around, I think, as most of our listeners, is like when you pull an old vintage camera or large format camera out in public, people just like, well, what is that? You know, with that giant freaking Graflex, it gets noticed. And it ended up having a magazine publisher, a guy who runs and owns American Flyer, which is a quarterly mountain bike magazine here in the States. He saw me at an event that I was photographing, and they're doing a feature on me in their first ever photo annual.
Really?
Because of him seeing that camera and being like, what the hell is that? Who the hell are you? You have a press credential. What the is this? And being like, I'll publish your stuff. And they're doing a feature on me in their Outlaws section of their photo annual. So, which is kind of cool. And of course, then that camera dies like afterwards. I'm like, son of a bitch.
Is it fixable? Because you can send it to...
No, it's the base. The whole box is just knocked off square. Like you'd have to strip it down and like take the wood itself, like take everything out of it, and then take the wood itself and re-square the wood and then reinstall everything. Which is just like a task. You know, it's less the mechanical task of like, oh, the shutter is broken, let's replace the curtain, and more like the entire box is out of true. We need a carpenter to re-true it square and then reinstall everything.
So how did you? What was the build like for the lens? Was it a handmade lens? It was handmade lens. Well, it must have been a handmade lens because it's kind of shit.
Because it's me. Because how shitty is that what you just said?
No, I was going to say something disparaging, but then I thought, I couldn't build one, so
yeah, you could,
and it looks beautiful. I love the effect, and it's it is. You're showing me something. You're holding.
Yeah, it's a handmade lens. It's. Is
this the one you? This isn't the one you were playing with the Mamiya body. What was that? That was, and you stripped the elements out.
No, that was it's not the same elements. This is actually the same sort of what I call a recipe that I used for that 4x5 sliding box camera that I built at the start of the pandemic, but just slightly different build. This one I actually have an M42 aperture on it, so it's got a modern sort of aperture that you can change,
close up and down. Yep.
Yeah, so it's not the Watergate. It's not the Watergate aperture. It's completely disassemblable, so you can like clean it and everything. But it throws it throws at least a 5x7, if not a larger. And actually, I need to put it on my 8x10 camera. I need to be able to throw an 8x10, but it throws at least a 5x7 image size, and it's really nice. I think, Frank, if you're listening, I think I might build one, because now that I put it on the replacement for the 3A is a standard Graflex Graflex B 4x5 SLR. So I'm going down to 6x12 panoramics, which hurts my soul. But it throws a beautiful 4x5 image, this lens. So I'm thinking I'm going to build one for Frank Thorpe.
So what was the
and send it to him.
Is there like a donor body that you used there? What was it?
No, this is actually, oddly enough,
because it looks quite professional. What you're
this is just a lens hood. This is an M42 to 52 millimeter lens hood, and then I just inserted the lens element inside the lens.
So
hood.
you've got the lens hood. You've got a single meniscus lens.
This is two acromats, two matching acromats,
and then you've got the
PVC pipe.
PVC pipe. Is that where the aperture?
No. So
what did you go out and buy then? You must have gone out and bought
I bought the lens hood,
the aperture bit. So you're holding up a lens hood with two lenses in,
a standard lens hood,
which you just forced in or glued in or something.
Yeah, and then I bought. The only difficult thing to really get is, it's not that difficult. You just have to get them off of eBay and wait a few weeks for them to arrive. But an M42 aperture.
Okay. So this is what you're holding up to the lens is a round ring with a
built-in aperture.
With a built-in aperture.
Yeah, okay. And it's an M42 standard.
So that fits into your lens hood or whatever you've got there.
And then I just bought an M42 to M52 adapter. Right. So this threads in the M52 adapter, and then M52 adapter goes into the front and the back, right? The lens hood here and the PVC pipe on the back. And that's it. It's really quite simple.
Wow. Okay. Well, I'll take it back. Maybe. So you got your glass from
Shed, from Fred.
Friend's Shed or something.
Yeah, from Fred. Yeah, two 360 millimeter acromats, coated acromats, and they throw a really nice.
Was some mathematical figuring to work out the distance between them, or did you just know that? No.
Well, it's sort of set because I got this aperture to deal with, right? The aperture sort of forces the distance. No matter what, you're going to have at least that distance to deal with. So, but either which way, the two 360s will always make something close to 180.
So you haven't got a piece of glass either side of the aperture?
I do.
You do have.
So there's a piece of glass in front of it.
Okay,
right. That wedged into the lens hood, and there's a piece of glass behind it.
Right, I can see. Yeah, right. Now I can see it completely now. Right. And then both of those screw into the into the.
And then
diaphragm.
I just because you can take it apart. It's fully mountable onto whatever lens boards you want to put into. Right.
How clever is that?
And that's that. So, I'm gonna probably buy this setup again. And make one for Frank to put on his Washington DC, because he uses a 6-inch, which is just about this, and it'll work really well. And I'm super curious to see what he'd get with it.
Awesome.
It's a little slow though. It's like an f8 because this aperture's maximum opening is 25 millimeters.
No, you can work with that though.
So and his brass lens is an f4. So it's 2-stop difference.
Yeah.
But for his outside stuff or things where he has more light, it might be interesting. But either which way, I just think it'd be fun to see. It'll be fun to see what he can do with it.
And your work, I read your blog and photographs. They're up on this site called Radavist. Is that a cycling site or is that?
Yeah, it's a cycling culture sort of news site run by a guy named John. He founded it a while ago, and he actually the Radavist actually pays for work, which is nice. Most cycling websites and public they don't pay much, if at all. And then cycling media definitely is very, like Alys is saying, like commercial work versus editorial work. The cycling industry is such as that most photographers who work in cycling, 4/5 of what they do is commercial, because the editorial doesn't pay shit. And the editorial stuff is all sorry folks, fluff pieces, because it's dominated by the commercial aspects and by the corporations who feed cycling. So there's nothing really deep. There's nothing super. Nobody's doing exposés on Trek or Specialized or like bad practices, because if they do, they'll pull the advertising from that magazine or that website and they die. So it's a very different world from the editorial world that I'm used to, or that I idealize. Right. Like I'm not going to the Gravel World Championships next month because I can't afford it, because I need commercial work in order to afford to go there. because the editorial work won't pay anywhere close to enough to actually cover the expenses.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. Well, that's brilliant. Thanks for putting some context to that.
Long-winded.
While I've been chatting, I did email Simon and ask if we've got any emails, but he hadn't. But we have had one. We have had one donation to our coffee account, which we'll promote in a minute. But I've got an email because
screens.
Yeah. So I've been using. We've been away for 10 days in the caravan, and I took with me just my Rolleiflex and some color film because you know that I've been getting into color printing and so on.
And color developing, by the way, right?
Yeah, and I love the square format, and I don't exclusively use square format clearly because I have a large format camera. But I found the discipline of just having the Rolleiflex over that 10 days and just using that. Okay, I had my Horizon swing lens camera, but that's just a gimmick, really. So my main photography was with the Rolleiflex, and the discipline of just having the one camera, one lens, one format was just really liberating, And I did replace the screen a while back, but it was I'm still not overly happy with it. So I bought screens from Rick Olson in the past. He's a guy in the States, and some folks will know him. He makes them for medium format cameras by and large, and they're called bright screens. And the one that he recommends for TLRs have a little 13 mil sort of focusing bubble thing in the middle. And I've had one for my RB67, and it's great. So I ordered one for the Rolleiflex. And when I was communicating with him, I said, because it wasn't Rick Olson, that the order went through to a guy called Lance Clark. And I thought, well, that's weird. I'm sure
that is weird.
I've had emails from Rick Olson. It was Richard, really. So I emailed Lance and said, well, what's the story with your company? And what's Rick Olson? What's he up to? Anyway, so I got this lovely email from Richard Olson. And he says, so if you may, I'll read it because it is really interesting. And, folks out there may or may not be aware of bright screens because he has them for large format cameras as well, but I'll come on to that. He says, hi, Andrew, Lance forwarded your email to me, so I thought I would drop you a line to fill you in a bit. I guess I'll start at the beginning. Apologies for the resulting boredom. No, it really wasn't. We'll get to the present eventually. So Rick says, I first started cutting and selling focusing screens back around 2006. What started that was I had purchased a screen on eBay that was advertised as being for my Pentacon 6.
Baby, my love.
When that screen arrived, I was a bit surprised to discover that it was 11 millimeters too large in one direction and 13 millimeters too large in the other.
Oh, come on.
Yeah. This didn't strike me as a sort of situation that a typical photographer would find ideal. Yeah, understatement. So I decided to purchase the screens in larger quantities and cut them to fit a variety of cameras, which you'd have thought the eBay seller would have done anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway, if he said they fitted a Pentacon 6, but they were like 13 millimeters too big. So that the photographers wouldn't be stuck doing it themselves. Well, they shouldn't be, should they? So he said that those screens were coming from China. Yeah. After several years, one of my customers informed me that Jim Lakey, the founder of Bright Screen, had passed away. The company had ceased operations, and his widow had a large quantities of molded screens that were much better quality than the ones I was selling from China. More importantly, she had the injection mold to make them, stored in her garage.
Tomato, my friend.
He introduced us to one another, and I began selling custom cut bright screens, originally alongside my lower priced Chinese screens, and finally as my only offering. After having consumed all her old stock, I made arrangements at the end of 2017 to purchase the bright screen mold and put it back into production in the United States. I think this is a great story.
I think it's awesome.
Being a plastics engineer as my day job, we should get him on. I had a relationship with a good molding company in Ohio, about a 4-hour drive from where I live. There were extra inserts with the mold, and over time we had added the split image bright screen MPD, go to his website, and the all matte bright screen MAT, again, go to his website, to the original Micro Prism Center Bright Screen MP, which is the one I've ordered for my Rolleiflex. Over the past 2 years, I have increased the range of camera applications by purchasing a CNC milling machine and writing programs for more complicated screen shapes and engraving patterns. And he does. He has a lot of, you can have it, your screens engraved with like a, the rule of thirds thing, or different grid patterns or no grid patterns. It's very, it's very customable when you go to his website. So Rick goes on to say, I will turn 70 next year, and it became clear that I needed to find a way to dial back on the amount of work I was putting into the focusing screens. I was fortunate. I've missed a bit. There we go. Sorry, let's rewind. So after he bought his CNC milling machines, he says, between the increased range of camera models covered, increasing word of mouth publicity, and the arrival of the COVID outbreak in 2020, the volume of sales tripled, then quadrupled from what it had been previously. I had retired from my day job in 2019, so I was able to handle the volume, but what I had envisaged as a low-key retirement hobby was becoming more akin to an unsought full-time job. So then he says, I'll turn 70 next year, and it became clear that I needed to find a way to dial back on the amount of work I was putting into the focusing screens. I was very fortunate to find Lance Clark, so that's where he comes into it, who was an engineer employed by the molding company in Ohio, where I was molding the screens. Lance has the great advantage of being expert in the materials and processes involved in producing the screens and being close to the facility where they're produced. Last year, we began a training program in which Lance came down to Lexington and learned how to perform the secondary operations of cutting, engraving, and finishing the screens, and all the other details required to take over this part of the process. After several months, this spring in 2022, we relocated the cutting machine and other tools from Lexington to Ohio. Since April, Lance has been handling the cutting, finishing, and sales of the screens, in addition to the actual molding, which he had already been doing earlier. I'm still involved, although we are not in the same location. I'm providing technical support, helping to identify cameras in odd or special situations, and when needed, providing additional CNC programs to create new screen configurations. With this arrangement, I am confident that Bright Screen will be able to continue to provide the same or better quality product as ever before, perhaps with some further new additions to the line for years to come. The quality of the MPD screen has improved on Lance's watch, and the MAT screen is a new addition, both indications of good things to come. On the note of the large format screens, unlike the medium format Bright screens, the large format screens are not molded in the USA, and we do not possess the mold. For these screens, we are working with new old stock screens, which were molded in Japan several years ago. Our supply of large format screens is not unlimited, as is the case of medium format, but our supply is large, several hundred pieces. But unlike the medium format screens, all large format screens are cut by hand using fixtures and templates rather than by a computer program machine. Lance and I look forward to years of collaboration with Bright Screen. To date, the arrangement has gone flawlessly, with the only visible changes being improvements in both product and services. I have no doubt that this trend will continue. Please let us know if there's anything you would like to discuss in more detail. Thanks for writing. Best wishes, Rick. So I read that and thought, wow, well, fantastic. I just asked for a little bit of detail and pretty much got his life story. I'm sure if he came on the show, he'd probably, I don't know if he'd enlarge on that, but what can I say? Were you familiar with Bright Screen as a company?
Not at all. I mean, I'm a fan now just because Pentagon 6s and like those are my jam, my love. At least in medium format land. If only they were even remotely.
Well, they are super bright lenses. There's a link on his website to a comparison with BT Interscreens. and they compare extremely favorable. When you looked at the review that someone had done, I couldn't really tell the difference between one or the other. So he was, before the pandemic, he was selling these screens for his medium format cameras for $80 of the US dollars, including shipping anywhere in the world.
Yeah, which is great.
And now it's gone up to $100, including shipping for anywhere in the world, which works out about, I think I paid about £85. So there are cheaper options, but these are very high quality. And if you're looking to replace a screen and you perhaps can't find, getting a Maxwell, I think these days they are still available, but I think it's quite complicated getting hold of them.
Right.
And, Rick's website is there. It's ready to go. And it's clearly in good hands for the future.
Yeah. I mean, and speaking as someone who, at least at the moment, like, especially with these old like Graflexes and whatnot, it's a struggle. Sometimes just because the glass is dirty and you get a little bit better when you clean them, or even with the Pentacons, like, it's just, and also because I'm a glutton for punishment with homemade lenses, let's not forget that. But it is a struggle at times to get a fine focus, to actually see through your ground glass, and an older dimmer mirror. Because the other thing that we often forget is these older cameras, like the mirrors don't stay bright forever. Like they age too. And between an old mirror and an old, dirty, scratched up, aged ground glass, it can be completely difficult. I'm just dropping some F-bombs to drive Simon crazy, but it can be really difficult to focus, especially quickly.
I took my lens hood off. Well, you have to take it off to fit this the last time I changed the screen, but I was very keen to look at the mirror thing, inside the twin lens reflex. And I think there are some aftermarket sellers of replacement Rolleiflex mirrors, because they're fixed, obviously, and they can degrade over time, and you should avoid trying to clean them with cloths and stuff, because you'll just F up the coating. But mine is pretty bright, so I just gave it a dust, and with a new screen, it's going to be good, I'm sure.
Yeah. So, but yeah, that's cool.
Anyway, so
keep us in the loop, like when he starts to do large format stuff.
Well,
sure.
He sounds like he's got large format. The other guy I've bought large format screens from, and I'd recommend is I'll put a link into the show notes. He lives in Lithuania, and Vigist, I think his name, Vigist, and he makes when I dropped my 4.5 back off my bomb camera and broke the screen recently, I got a replacement from him, shipped to the UK for 25 quid, I think, so and they're the same screens that go in the chroma cameras in the UK, so that's a good option as well if you're in Europe or the UK. So
have you been doing any large format? Hold on, you busted out a Rolly. Have you been doing any large format? Have we all meandered away from large format recently?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't care about large format anymore. No, I have actually started my project. I don't want to bore people with that. So I've got this rather what do we photograph? There's a joke about Australians will bet on anything, even flies crawling up a wall, So what's the most boring thing you can photograph? Well, that's in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? You can photograph a load of water towers head on and call it a work of art and get applauded by it. So we won't go there. But my work really photographically wise is based in this area where I live in the Cambridgeshire Fens.
Mm-hmm.
And I look around for things to, form little long-term projects with, and I've got a few on the go, but I think I've spoken on this show before about it. I don't know if I have, apologies, about the pumping stations that keep so these are brick. These days, they're fairly nondescript brick buildings. Some a bit more attractive than others, and they pump water from one part of the fens to another to keep it dry, because it should be flooded really, and to allow crops to be grown. So, and these are and the fenland areas are divided up into geographical areas managed and governed by local authorities called drainage boards.
That's a great name.
Drainage.
I'm drainage board member.
So I live right on the edge of the middle level drainage board. It's a bit like Middle Earth, with wizards and Tolkien and stuff. So I emailed the middle level drainage board and said,
that should be a T-shirt.
I said I want I want to do this project of with a large format film camera and making fiber prints in my darkroom of photographing in not just close up headshots of these pumping stations, but set in the scenery, with a bit of context in the landscape, photographing all your pumping stations. But I don't know where they all are. So a nice lady emailed me back and says, well, that sounds very interesting. I think she was being serious. And here's a map of all where they all are. And she said some of them are on private land. You might have to do some negotiation, but keep us posted, because we're really interested in what you end up with. So I'll hold her to that. So I went out a few weeks ago to the first 3 locations that I thought were fairly accessible, and the weather was a bit of sun, a bit of cloud, a bit of sky interest. It was late afternoon, wasn't quite sort of golden hour, but I had probably things to do in golden hour, so I went out in the afternoon, and I made some large format photographs with the Toyo of 3 of these locations. The only one of them I had to use my 90mm lens, and the only one I had with me was my super angulon small little diddy thing, which little diddy thing, yeah, and it's got some lens separation around the edge.
Oh, perfect.
But I had to, once it stopped down a couple of stops, it goes anyway. I think even when I've shot it wide open, I couldn't really notice it, to be honest.
Yeah.
So I was using I was alternating between my standard 150 lens and my 210 lens. And then the only other one I've got is a 90 anyway. But I've got the Japanese make. I've forgotten. The Japanese lens. Not Schneider.
Not Nikkor?
Yeah, Nikkor, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I didn't have that with me. I just had this little Schneider lens. So, and the negatives look great. I was using Fomapan because, it's cheap and cheerful. And
yeah.
Developing it in a Pyro-based developer. And I haven't made the prints yet, but, I'm sure they'll be fine. So I started that. So I have been doing a bit. But I'm not just a large format photographer. It's a bit of a almost a sideline, really. I don't even know why I'm doing this podcast.
Well, I sent my Intrepid off to Wayne and Alana, and they've been using it, and that was my main 4x5 workhorse. So some of those bike events I've shot with that because it's just so light. And easiest up and so portable. Has she
finished her project yet?
No, that's a saga.
The slave houses.
Saga. Yeah, that got a little bit sidelined for a bit because of. It's probably best to leave her to explain it, but because of some issues around, a great aunt sort of pulling back from the story and saying, having some discomfort around talking about it or having that covered.
Okay.
And so which was difficult for her because it's part of her family's identity too. So it's less, not just about delaying the project, but also sort of reevaluating a bunch of identity that her family has been told and grown up around too. But that camera is still sort of off on loan with those two.
Is Wayne okay now? Because we're talking.
Wayne he's home.
He got hit by a car, didn't he?
Yeah, he got put underneath a car on his motorcycle, pretty much. So he's in physical rehab, and the project that the Smithsonian is funding for him to build an 8x10 camera and big wall climb up into these old Anasazi dwellings with mummies in them. He's still hell bent for leather to do in September. So actually, I have to, speaking of that, get on building a camera lens for that camera. Because he's commissioned me to build the lens for it, which will be super fun, super difficult to do. But once I have it done, I will have a camera lens that's going to perhaps be in the Smithsonian for a time, which is kind of
sounds
crazy, actually.
In some way, you'll live on.
Yeah, exactly. And I also have purchased an 8x10 camera.
That one you picked up for $300
bucks, 300 American bucks for a hand-built, beautifully hand-built. It's like someone milled stuff. Whoever did this was serious. With 3 lenses, 4 film holders, dark cloth, a tripod as well. everything.
One of those big sexy wooden ones.
Yes.
Big sexy wooden tripods.
No, it's a Bogan. It's a modern.
Oh, is it?
It's a big, heavy, modern Bogan tripod. My challenge is I don't have any way to develop it. Like, so I played around with using, a constant agitation developer roller and everything, but I haven't gotten any functional images out of it. So because I can't see what the hell's going on. I'm shooting lithofilm because it's the only thing I can afford. So I can't really see what the fuck is going on. So I've set the 8x10 aside for the moment until we get the darkroom built. And then I can go borrow somebody's darkroom and trade develop the film.
Are you building a darkroom at home?
Yeah, I'm turning, God help me, I'm turning 50 this year. So for my 50th birthday, Heather's like, we can either have a big party.
You don't look a day over 60.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That means a lot to me, actually, especially after COVID. I'm glad that I only look 10 years older than I am. But we could either have a big party or we could build a darkroom. And I was like, darkroom.
Build a darkroom.
So we're currently like pricing the materials. We'll probably put the walls and do it ourselves because having a contractor would be too expensive.
No, that's what I did.
We've got we picked up an 8-foot long metal sink on surplus. That's just ginormous, but only weighs like 100 pounds because it's aluminum. So I'll be able to do up to 16 by 20 trays in it. And then a friend, Kendra, has a big counter. She's going to donate to it and a bunch of other darkroom stuff because she has a darkroom in her basement that's sort of not that functional anymore, but she wants to print. And then I've got a Bessler 23C over there. That somebody else donated, and a full another friend of mine gave me a couple of years ago, actually, something that somebody gave her. It's a full, you should see it. I'll send you a photo. It's a full like plumbing setup for a photo darkroom, cold water, and
I know the sort of thing you mean. Yeah,
with the cold water and hot water filter.
Yeah,
even this person, all copper, and this person even has a pressure monitor before and after each filter. Well,
you need it, don't you, to say if it's got blocked?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's the full Monty, and that's
I think
in my shed.
I've seen pictures. I don't know whether Wayne Setzer put something similar into his recently. Might have been Wayne.
So it's completely bonkers. So yeah, and it'll just go in the
so the Bessler 23C. What does that got to in terms of negative size?
I think it'll do. I'm hoping it'll do. I haven't actually checked. I don't know if it'll do 4x5 or not. I know for sure. Obviously, it'll do 120. It'll probably do 6.9 at least. Yeah. I don't know if it'll go all the way up to 4x5. Which for me is a bit of a challenge. Actually, I need something that'll go up to 5x7, right, with those panoramics.
Really? Yeah. Well, you can do if you want to do 6x17, you need 5x7 enlarger.
Yep.
Unless you want to crop the ends off, but you can do 6x12. I can do 6x12 prints, which then gets me questioning why I've got a 6x17 back, because I can scan it, using my lomography digitalizer thing.
Right.
But I'm not into scanning really. So.
Yeah, and I'm not into printing, honestly. Like, I'm putting the enlarger and stuff into it for the community aspect. Like Kendra, who's donating a bunch of stuff, she just wants to be able to, she doesn't really care about developing. She wants to print.
Yeah.
And she's a good friend. And she's donating a bunch of stuff to my darkroom. So I originally actually wasn't even going to have an enlarger in it. I was more interested in getting a big UV exposure to it and doing gum oil prints and cool shit like that.
You want a dark space, don't you?
Yeah.
Do things.
And for prints, I wanted to do one-off gum oils or tricolor prints or that sort of thing. I'm not that much.
Or start doing beautiful contact sheets,
exactly.
Edward Weston did with a light bulb.
So that's more in the long run for me. I'll put the enlarger in so other people in my community can use it. But I'm more interested in building out like a big 16 by 20 UV exposure unit.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what I'm about. That
sounds a load of fun. So
dope.
Let's
more swear words for Simon. Sorry, buddy. More bleepity bleep because it'll be bleep.
Let's start to wind down.
Yeah.
I realized we didn't ask Alys for any shout outs, but it seemed we've never had a guest. I don't think we've had a guest that's left halfway through. So I hadn't thought about
we'll email
how
her and put her shout outs in the notes. How about that?
I didn't think about how we were going to transgress from that into the next bit of the show. So we'll leave a bit of editing for Simon to do. Hopefully it'll be flawless and you won't notice.
Yes. And he won't edit that part out though, because there's no way to give a shout out to Simon, who's awesome.
who I've been speaking to while we've been chatting. So on that subject, coffee donors, look, listeners, I know we're not as regular as we used to, but we are trying.
It comes with age.
we're aiming at once a month now, and sometimes it takes another week to get the show out, but roughly once a month. We're going to try and churn these out. We may get more. We may get more regular eventually. But there we go. So we do have a donation site for helping Simon pay his hosting costs before he starts coming after Eric and me or sends the boys around. So if you want to donate to this wonderful show, all these wonderful guests that we have on, you can go to ko-fi.com/large format photography podcast, kofi-coffee.com. And we have had a donation.
Wow.
We haven't had any emails. So
nobody wants me to read their message.
We're very disappointed that we haven't got any emails. We'd love some emails from you because we know people listen. Well, at least 2 people. So Simon says, no emails. In other news, we received this year's only donation.
Woohoo!
Come on, £6 from Michael. Sorry, Michael, I don't have a surname. He says, your podcast has been the perfect blend of stimulation and relaxation. we like to stimulate and relax you. For a stay-at-home parent of a toddler, oh yeah, you need to stimulate it. Yeah,
need relaxation.
Please keep it up. Well, we're trying. Okay,
we're trying.
We have some interesting guests. Thank you very much, Michael. We have some interesting guests lined up, and I should be talking to Eric later about about the.
I'm going to harass Joshua Paul if you're listening. Mm-hmm. You're next. You're coming on, buddy.
We'll look for maybe a month's time. So, Eric, any shout outs?
Well, I mean, it gets boring, but for other people, but not boring for me, Heather. I mean, in particular, it should be less boring for other people for the shout out because she's like, I'm going to build a darkroom. I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, you've got to have buy-in. You've got to have buy-in from. Well,
in this case, she was more like, it wasn't me. It was me having to buy into it because she was like, I'm building you a darkroom.
Okay.
So no, it wasn't like, honey, would you build a darkroom? She was more like, hey, it's your birthday coming up. We're building a darkroom. I think mostly because she wants me to be able to shove all of my crazy into one spot and not have it overflow everywhere else. Little does she know that that's not going to work. But nonetheless, it'll at least allow me to dry my film in someplace other than the guest bathroom shower. So I suppose there's that. But yes, Heather, for sure, for those things. And then I think all of our guests, I mean, Alys, thank you, Alys, coming on. And for you to having her come back on. I wasn't familiar with her work, and her work is really, really, really lovely. And is something that I plan on looking at more to draw more inspiration from in terms of how to do work. So, yeah. And I'm really, I keep saying really, really, but that's too bad. Intrigued by the movie that she's doing. Like, I want to see the rough cut. Yeah. Alys, if you're listening, I want to see the rough cut. I won't share it with anyone, but I want to see the rough cut. So hint.
There's some great YouTube stuff of Alys being interviewed by her sister, who's, I forget what her sister does for a living, but she did a great interview, and she wrote the introductory essay in Ex Voto cool. as well. And what I liked about the essays, the 2 essays in Ex Voto, is that they weren't full of artistic bullshit, and concepts that I didn't really understand, because they weren't trying to be pretentious. There was none of that stuff in there. And so I applauded her last time round about the quality of the writing as well as the photography. The only thing is, it's the writing is really hard to see because it's on black paper and it's on like gold lettering, and you have to, what is there actually any writing here? So I'll give a shout out to someone we really ought to have on the show, except that we've had a lot of wet plate people on, so I haven't yet reached out to him. So Steve Legreese, who lives Suffolk way, I think a friend of mine, Jimmy Hickford, has met up with him a few times. Steve shares stuff in the Large Format Photography Podcast Facebook group, and he's been sharing some 10x8 wet collodion ambrotypes. So that's photographs on glass, of course, probably with a black background on. And he's been photographing beautiful gardens in Suffolk, which is people in England, people in Great Britain will know where Suffolk is. Eric won't know where it is.
No idea.
It's over on the East Coast. But and these have got their own particular charm. They're striking images because of the ortho nature of the image, I guess. And, they're got the weird stuff going on in the sky, which is down to coating, I guess. But they're beautiful. Steve, if you're listening, I really enjoyed looking at your wet collodion ambrotype plates of gardens in Suffolk. And at some point, we will have you on to chat about them.
Yeah, works for me.
So that's good, isn't it? Right.
Yeah.
So we've done shout-outs. Alys, you've gone. You can't do a shout-out. I've done a shout-out. Eric, if somebody does want to email the show, where should they send an email to?
That was not the question I was expecting. They should send it to large format photography podcast at gmail.com.
They really should. And we miss emails. We miss emails. I know.
I miss knowing that people are curious about things.
I know. Yeah. Yeah. We're obviously become irrelevant to people's lives now. They don't feel the need to write in. So, where can people follow you, Eric, if they have
just
a mind to?
Yeah, if they're crazy enough, the Instagrams is pretty much still where I do stuff. It's
And if they want to look at your cycling photographs with inappropriate lenses and links to the Radavist, I think you've shared. Right. I read your blog. I must have got it from an Instagram link.
Yep, you did. But the Instagram link is ERIKHMATHY. That's where. And there will be more lens build photos coming soon because, again, I have to build Wayne's 8x10. But also lots of photography stuff. And then the Radavist is the TheRadavist.com. And then you just search for my name in there. But we can put some stuff in the notes.
We can
follow.
And,
we can.
We can indeed.
Read the notes.
And you can find me in all those social media places, apart from TikTok, because I don't know what that is. And I always quite fancy doing a TikTok video.
Yeah.
Seems to be
that's for young people.
It is for young people, not for us old people. So you can find me, I think I'm just Warboy Snapper in most places, or my name, Andrew Bartram, in others. You'll find me anyway. Music was and is by Kevin MacLeod. The ever lovely and much admired by everybody tune called Two Finger Johnny. And Alys, if you're listening, thank you. It was an absolute pleasure. And Eric, it was good to catch up. We haven't done a catchy uppy thing in a while. Simon, you need to come back on and do a catchy uppy thing,
dude. Yeah, for sure.
All right,
miss you, Simon.
We do. We miss you. So there we are. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you shortly with another show. Cheers, Eric.
Cheers.
Bye.
See ya.